We were all wondering what could result from President Biden's giving Ukraine the go-ahead to use United States missiles to be fired into Russia. Today we have had the first reaction from Putin, a missile strike inside Dnipro in Ukraine. We're going to break down what happened, the possibly new technology involved, and even the history that may have fated Dnipro to be the target. So, let's get started.
A closer look.
We got news reports, we got experts weighing in, even some wild history you wouldn't believe. The whole shebang.
Looking forward to it.
And trust me, you're going to want to hear this. We're talking about tech, missile tech, that has even seasoned military guys scratching their heads.
Yeah, it's true. This wasn't just your average missile attack.
Right.
This Dnipro thing, it really shows how both sides are playing this strategic chess match, using force to send signals. It's high stakes.
Okay, so to understand this thing, we got to rewind a bit, right? Just before Dnipro, Ukraine pulls this move, kind of changes the whole game. They use those U.S. and British long-range missiles, those ICBM and Storm Shadows, to hit targets inside Russia. First time ever.
Right.
I mean, up to that point, the West had been super hesitant to give Ukraine weapons that could reach into Russia itself.
Absolutely.
They were worried it would be seen as a provocation. So were they right to be worried?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The concern was it would trigger a major escalation from Moscow. And, well, that's exactly what we saw. Putin updates Russia's nuclear doctrine, basically makes it easier to justify using nukes.
So let me get this straight. Ukraine hits inside Russia, and Putin's response is basically, don't push it, I might go nuclear. Am I oversimplifying that?
Not really, no. This is classic Putin, trying to reestablish control, sending that message. Any attacks on Russia will have major consequences. It's brinkmanship, plain and simple. Super dangerous game they're playing.
And it's into this super tense situation, right, that we get the Dnipro strike on November 21st. What was Russia's goal here?
Well, on the surface, they hit an industrial site, maybe tied to Ukraine's military production. But here's what's interesting. Dnipro itself has a history. Back in the Soviet days, it was a major hub for making missiles.
Wait, so they hit a place that used to make missiles?
Exactly.
That's like adding insult to injury or something? Is that significant at all, or just a historical footnote?
No, it's significant. We'll dig into that connection more later, but it hints that this wasn't just a random target. There's symbolism here, maybe a strategic message from Russia we need to unpack.
Okay, hold that thought, because I know everyone listening is probably wondering the same thing I am. What kind of missile was this? Ukraine saying ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, like the nuclear kind. U.S. officials are saying experimental IRBM, still serious, but shorter range. Break it down for us. What's the difference, and why should we care?
You're right, it gets confusing. So ICBM, that's designed to fly thousands of miles, hitting targets across continents. The big dogs, mainly for nuclear arsenals. IRBM's intermediate range are more limited, a few thousand kilometers usually. They pack a punch, but not on that ICBM scale.
So an ICBM would mean Russia used a weapon designed for nuclear war in a conventional attack. That's a massive escalation, right?
Absolutely, and it would be unprecedented. No country has ever used an ICBM in actual warfare. That's why this is so interesting. If Russia is willing to use that kind of weapon, even experimentally, it really changes how we understand their goals, how far they're willing to go.
Okay, so we got this mysterious missile, maybe a type never used before in war, hitting a target steeped in, well, missile history. But wait, there's a twist, right? Something about the payload itself had everyone buzzing.
You're talking about the MIRV, right?
Yeah, that's the part that had me going, wait, what? So for those listening who might not know, what does MIRV even stand for?
MIRV stands for Multiple Independently Targetable Reentry Vehicle. Basically, it means one missile carrying multiple warheads. Each one can hit a different target, like a cluster bomb of warhead.
Oh, okay, that is scary efficient. So what's the takeaway here? Russia just showing off its toys, or is there more to it?
That's the million-dollar question. And here's what makes it even more interesting. MIRVs are almost always on nuclear-capable missiles. So even though Dnipro wasn't a nuke, the message is clear. Russia's flexing a capability with huge implications, even if they didn't go all out this time.
So like a look what we could do kind of thing, not so subtle reminder.
Exactly. And this is where we got to start asking tough questions about Russia's motives. What were they trying to achieve with this attack? Just payback, or is there a deeper strategy here?
All right, so we left off with Russia sending this pretty loud message, that MIV'd missile on Dnipro, but a message to who? What are they trying to accomplish here?
Yeah, well, there's a few ways to look at it.
Yeah.
But I think it comes back to this whole power struggle thing. Remember, just a few days before the strike, Ukraine hit targets inside Russia. First time ever. Using those long-range missiles the West finally gave them.
Right, right.
That was a major hit to Russia's pride, their feeling of security. They had to respond, show they're still in control.
So this is just revenge, like an eye for an eye.
Payback's definitely part of it. Russia wants to make it clear, you hit us, we hit back harder. But there's strategy here, too. Got to remember those peace talks everyone's talking about.
Yeah.
Both sides are jockeying for position, trying to have the upper hand before those negotiations even start. What better way to do that than show off your scariest weapons?
Basically saying, we're still the big dog here, don't forget it. But is it working? Like, is it really going to scare Ukraine into making concessions?
It's a good question. It definitely has Ukraine and their allies on edge. Using an Arvad missile, even without a nuke, is a big step.
Right.
But it might also backfire. Could make Ukraine even more determined, push the West to send even more military aid.
So it's a risky move for Russia. And speaking of risky, there's that whole thing with those North Korean generals, supposedly at a Ukrainian command post that got hit by those Storm Shadow missiles. What's going on there?
Ah, yes, the North Korean angle. It really highlights how complicated this whole thing is.
Yeah.
So many players involved. This conflict could easily pull in other countries.
Yeah.
If North Korea is actively helping Russia, that changes things big time, raises the stakes even higher.
It's like this tangled web, more and more people getting pulled in, harder to tell who's on what side. Okay, but back to Dnipro. What's the reaction been from the rest of the world?
Lots of concern, as you can imagine, especially about things escalating further. Ukraine's calling on the UN, NATO to do something, condemning the attack. But there's a sense of helplessness, too. Like the world's just watching this thing spin out of control, and nobody knows how to stop it.
Like, we're on a runaway train headed for disaster.
And, of course, we have an unknown factor. What will happen when President Trump takes office? And what decisions will he make? All we know for sure is that he wants this war to end.
So Ukraine's not just fighting on the battlefield. They're racing the clock, trying to get as much support from the West as possible before a Trump win changes everything.
Absolutely. Adds even more uncertainty to a situation that's already unpredictable. But let's step back from the big picture for a second. Come back to Dnipro. We've talked about all the geopolitics, the military stuff, but we can't forget about the human cost. What actually happened to the people on the ground when that missile hit? It's easy to lose sight of that, get lost in the strategy and all that, but this is about real people whose lives are being torn apart. Bring us back down to earth. What happened in Dnipro?
Well, the reports say the missile hit that industrial site, like we talked about. Lots of damage, fires. But what's crazy is there were only 2 injuries reported.
2 injuries? From an MIV missile? That's hard to believe.
I know, right? Shows that it wasn't a crowded area and that people in Dnipro probably had some warning. They've been under threat for months now. They know what to do when the alarms go off.
So they've gotten used to living in a war zone. But even if they're physically prepared, what about mentally? The fear of knowing your city could be hit by a weapon like that, it's got to be terrifying.
Yeah, the psychological impact of this war is immense. The constant fear, the not knowing what's next, losing loved ones. It's trauma that'll last for generations. And this attack on Dnipro, especially with those hints of nuclear escalation, it's definitely made things worse.
And it's not just Ukraine. The whole world's watching, holding their breath, wondering what'll happen next. So let's circle back to that target you mentioned earlier. You said it was more than just some random factory. Tell us more about Dnipro's history with missile production and why Russia might have picked this specific spot.
Right, so this is where it gets really interesting. Remember how Dnipro was a big missile production center back in the Soviet days? Well, some sources say that the exact site that was hit was actually involved in making, wait for it, ICBMs.
No way! So they had a place that used to make the same type of missile they might have just used against them. That's almost too perfect, too symbolic. Is that confirmed or just a theory?
It's important to be careful. There's a lot of propaganda flying around. But if it's true, it adds a whole other layer of meaning to this attack.
It's like Russia's sending a message, not just about what they can do now, but about their past, their history as this military superpower. We've been doing this forever. Don't underestimate us.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, what's their endgame here? Are they just trying to protect their borders and keep Ukraine out of NATO? Or is there a bigger plan, something about restoring the Soviet Union, that old glory?
Big questions, and we're going to keep digging into them as this conflict unfolds. But for now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this MRV missile. What do we know about how it works, its range? What does using it here tell us about Russia's plans? That's where we'll pick up in part 3. All right, back to unpack this mystery missile a little more. So it was RRV'd, multiple warheads. That alone is pretty unnerving. But the missile itself, you said it was experimental, which honestly, that just makes it even creepier.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so interesting, but also a lot harder to figure out. We don't know everything about this specific missile, but even the little we do know, it tells us Russia's pushing the limits here, maybe further than we thought.
Okay, walk us through it. What have you been able to put together from the reports and all the analysis?
Well, you remember we were talking about those conflicting accounts, whether it was an ICBM or an IRBM. Even that confusion is kind of a clue. It points to this maybe being a new type of missile, something intelligence agencies haven't totally categorized yet. And if that's true, that leads to a whole bunch of questions about what Russia's really up to.
So they might be testing out, like, brand new tech, never-before-seen stuff in the middle of a war.
Seems like it, yeah. It's risky, even for Russia. But it also gives us some insight into their thinking, how they might be looking at this whole conflict long term.
Okay, I'm listening. How does this experimental missile play into their bigger strategy?
Think about it this way. If Russia did use an ICBM, even an experimental one, huge escalation, right? But also not super practical. ICBMs there for nuclear war, hitting things across continents. Not really what you'd use to take out some industrial facility.
You're saying it was maybe more about the message than the military goal?
Exactly. It's a power move, showing off to the world. Look what we can do. Don't even think about messing with us. But then there's that MRV payload we got to factor in.
Right, those multiple warheads. So how does that fit into this whole psychological thing they seem to be doing?
Think of the implications. This attack wasn't a nuke, but the technology is closely linked. Using MRV missile, it's basically saying, we could have gone nuclear, we didn't this time, but don't think we won't. It's a threat, no question.
Pretty terrifying message, and it raises so many questions. Just showing off, or is this like a taste of what's to come? What does it mean for Ukraine, for everyone? I mean, for all of us?
Those are the questions we should all be asking right now. And honestly, the answers are scary unclear. We're in uncharted territory here. This level of uncertainty is, well, unsettling, to say the least. That's why we got to stay informed, analyze everything, and really think about what the consequences could be.
Couldn't agree more. So if we had to sum this all up for our listeners, what are the key takeaways here? What should they be paying attention to?
The biggest thing is, this goes way beyond one missile strike. It could be a turning point in the whole war, a shift towards things being even more unpredictable, this willingness to escalate. Yeah. And it's not just about Ukraine anymore. This has global implications. International relations, the arms race, the future war itself, it's all connected.
So we're all part of this. Whether we realize it or not, we can't afford to ignore it.
You got it.
Yeah.
We need to stay engaged, keep asking the hard questions, and hold our leaders accountable for their decisions. Because those decisions, they're going to shape the world we live in.
Us, as we tried to make sense of this, it's a lot to process.
It's been a pleasure.
This is definitely a story that's going to keep developing, and we'll be following it closely. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those questions coming. We're all in this together.